Now that we've got our fetch user action creator put together, we're going to start to create our component that is going to display just the author's name. And again, we're going to call that the user header. So back inside of my components directory, I will make a new file called userheader.js. And then inside of here, we're going to put together some boilerplate for a class-based component. So I'm going to import React from React. I'll create class userHeader that extends React.component. And then inside of here, I will define my render method. Inside the render method, for right now, we'll just return a simple div that has the text like user header. And then as usual at the bottom, we will place our export default user header. All right, so we're going to want to make sure that this thing eventually is going to call an action creator to fetch the user that it needs to show on the screen. We'll get around to that in just a second, but for right now, let's make sure that the user header gets displayed inside of our post list at the appropriate location. So I'm going to flip back over to my post list component. At the top, I'm going to import user header from user header. And then down inside of my render list method, we're going to create a new instance of this component right after the closing div on the h2 and the paragraph tags. So right here, right underneath one div, I'm going to put user header. Now when we create this component, we need to tell it exactly what user ID it needs to show, or excuse me, the ID of the user that it needs to show. So we need to pass that down as a prop. Now we could certainly pass down a prop called ID, but just to make the terminology inside of here a little bit easier to follow, I'm going to call this prop user ID, just to make sure it's really clear we are working with the ID of some particular user. And then for the value of that, I'm going to reference post.userID. Now we are able to pass in post.userID, recall, because if we go back over to the post endpoint, every post object has a user ID property, and that is the ID of the user that made that post. All right, so now if we save this, we should be able to flip back over to our application, and hopefully, if we refresh the page, I think that I kind of have my development server not running right now. Believe it or not, I definitely just changed this, but I'm not seeing that update. So I'll tell you what, there we go. All right, that's better. Finally see the update. I had stopped my server between the last video and this one. That's why I thought maybe I hadn't started back up. Anyways, we now see the text user header here on the screen. So that definitely looks pretty reasonable. Now let's keep going with the user header. So I'm going to go back over here into the user header component. We want to make sure that we call an action creator inside of here that's going to fetch the appropriate user. So at the top, we're going to make sure that we import the connect function and the action creator itself, and then we will use the connect tag to wire up the action creator to the component. So at the top, I'm going to import connect from React Redux, and I'll import fetch user from actions. So now down at the bottom, I'll place the connect function and make sure I wrap my component with a second set of parentheses. Right now, we do not have a map state to props function, so I'm going to pass a null as the first argument, and then for the second argument, I'll do an object with fetch user. Okay, so now the last thing we have to do, inside of our component, whenever this component appears on the screen, we're probably going to want to make sure that we attempt to fetch the given user that this thing is supposed to show. So I'm going to define component did mount inside of here. Whenever user header is displayed, I'm going to call my action creator through this.props.fetch user. And then remember, we need to pass in the ID of the user that we want to fetch. And as we saw just a second ago, we are passing in the ID of the user that we want to fetch as a prop called user ID. So back over here, I'll make sure I call fetch user with this.props.user ID. Okay, and that's pretty much it. So we can save this, and I'll flip back over to my application, and it looks like everything still works. Now we don't have any reducer to actually pick up the data from the request that we are making and eventually get access to it and show it on the screen. So we'll take a quick pause right here and start to tackle that in the next video. Now, before we move on, I want to remind you, I had told you that we were going to run into one or two little challenges. So if you are looking at some aspect of this application right now and saying, Stephen, you know what? I don't think this is working the way we expect it to work. That is fine. All right, I'm not going to tell you exactly what it is because I kind of want you to stumble into it yourself. But again, if you see something that looks weird, that is totally fine, and we're going to fix it up in a couple of videos. Okay, so let's take a pause right here, and we'll start working on a reducer in the next video.